Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Brooke Mitchell, and today's topic is Becoming a Birder Part 5 Honk if you're migrating with NatHab Expedition Leader Kristina Disney. Thank you so much for being here today, Kristina. Over to you.
Thank you, Brooke. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in today. And yes, just like everything else in the world, there is a day to celebrate bird migration. It happens twice a year. So this year, or sorry, it's always the second Saturday in May and the second Saturday in October. So this year, like it said, it was going to be October 12th. And so leading up to that, I thought, what a better way to celebrate all of the birds that are passing us by on their seasonal migration than to have a little chat about what they're doing and how they're doing it and some of the fantastic things that they pull off in nature. I think birds are, again, always such a form of jealousy for us poor humans who don't have our wings to fly away when the weather gets to a level that we're maybe not a fan of. But we're going to keep going with the birding story. We've gotten all the way through parts 1, 2, 3, and 4. If you've been following along, that's great. If you're just joining us for the first time today, do not worry. I'll bring a few pieces with us along the way, but never so much that you feel like you're jumping in and a bit lost. And so I wanted to start us off with a story about water. Last year's International or World Migration Day was about birds and water migration. This year it's focusing on 2024 is on birds and insects. But for anyone who's been around a few webinars with me, you might know that that's what I do in my other jobs, as I'm a PhD student who studies water. So nerdy old me, about 2 weeks ago, went on a tour of our city's reservoir. So that's Souk Lake here on Vancouver Island. And it was a guided tour, which also, by the way, being a guide and going on a guided tour is always such a sort of trippy effect. I don't know if this is how chefs feel when they go to someone else's kitchen, but you never quite settle in. You're, watching the information as much as you're watching the person. It's always kind of a trippy thing. But I was on this tour, and one of the things they were so very proud of, which I was kind of fascinated by, is essentially this is a drinking water source. And so the goal is to keep it as clean as possible. So one of the things they try to do is they try to keep as much waterfowl from calling this place home as possible. Really, again, they're aiming for sterile. And so they have a wildlife program, and one of that is removing Canada geese. And for anyone who is hanging out on golf courses or parks or lakesides, you know that the geese are not a big fan of heading out. And so the water manager's solution to this, their wildlife program, is that they track where the nests are along the lake. And then they, in the springtime when the eggs are born, they actually go in and they addle the eggs. Basically, they shake them. And so it stops the eggs from developing. The idea being that geese will always come back to where they're born. So if you don't have any more geese born on a lake, it means that it won't become a spot for them in their plant. Now, it might still be a migration stopover, but it won't necessarily become a place where they're hanging out long term. So it's an interesting one as far as management perspective goes, but it was kind of cool to learn about and to give some context. But why was it that they didn't want the geese in the lake, right? Again, anyone who is a golfer out there or is walking through parks, there's a reason you don't lay down your blanket, right? It's because Canada geese, as well as a lot of our other migratory species, that is a lot of poop that comes out, right? And so huge amount of fertilizer that gets added to the lake. They're trying to keep that lake essentially really nutrient limited so that it slows down the amount of growth and keeps the water really nice and clean. And if you have a whole bunch of birds stopping over, which is what it was like where I grew up, so not Canada geese, but snow geese, every year where I grew up, there was a town next to us where they had to have a boil water advisory because when the geese came, there was so much nutrients added to the lake where they were getting their water from that it became unsafe to drink, right? So different approaches. One community could afford to create a sterile lake. The other one just put on a boil water advisory for a little while. Different problems to different solutions. And I know you probably didn't think we were going to start this migration story from the back end rather than from the front end, but I think it's such an important part of migration that nobody thinks about. And so migration is a way that nutrients travel across the world. And we don't more probably think about that. But there's this fun quote that I'm going to use as a comparison. And there's lots of different renditions of this, just the idea being that education is the great equalizer, right? This one's a bit more wordy than that. There's different versions of it. But essentially the idea being that there are different factors or facets in life that equal the playing field. Now, when we're talking about Mother Nature, migration is what is the great equalizer. So what do I mean by that? This is an image of the primary production all across our planet. So we can look at it terrestrially and aquatically, or we'll look at the water first. So the sort of purple into blues, that's where we have the least amount of chlorophyll. So in other words, that's the least amount of primary production, or plants converting CO2 and oxygen into carbs for the rest of us poor fools to snack on, the rest of our heterotrophs. And then once we get into that greens, oranges, or greens, yellows, reds, then we're getting into really high productivity. Now and then, if we look at that on a terrestrial side, the darker greens have a lot of productivity, and then those lighter browns have less so. And so this color-coded map should kind of map up in some ways with the way that we think about it. But for some folks, you might be surprised to see that Arctic, right? Look at how bright it is in the ocean and how dark it is on land. Even though we think about the Arctic as a place maybe of scarcity and, if we think about being in the cold and there's lack, the reality is that when we go to these northern latitudes, we are getting a huge amount of increase in mass. So we get less diversity, but for the animals that are there, they can be way, way more of them because there's so much more production. And you've got to be thinking, Kristina, the place is half frozen part of the year. How is it possible that all of that food is up there? Well, it has to do with different limiting effects. So again, this kind of goes back to what I was talking about before of diversity versus mass. When we think about the tropics, we think about it as being this very lush, beautiful environment, and it 100% is. But as a productive stance, it has a huge amount of diversity. But if you look at this, the green line is the tropics, and it's showing how productivity changes throughout the year for these different latitudes across our planet. And in the same way that the weather doesn't really change a lot in the tropics, the productivity doesn't really change a lot. Versus when we go to the temperate regions, we get blooms, or we get these high productivity zones in our spring, and sometimes even second follow-up ones in our fall. And they're pretty big, but the biggest one, the hugest amount of increase in productivity, comes from our polar region. It just shoots off, skyrockets into the sky, or proverbial sky. Well, how is that possible? What's going on? Why are these things different, right? This is all one big planet. Well, it has to do with something called the law of minimums. And when we think about this, let's see if anyone's a gardener out there, or I grew up farming, so that's kind of where my brain goes to first. Whenever we are growing something, it will only grow to the rate of its lowest potential, or to its lowest accessible nutrient or resource. That could be sunlight, that could be potassium, that could be water, right? Whatever the thing is that it's missing, that's as much as it's capable of growing. So Liebig came with this law, the idea, right? So in this case, it's showing all these different nutrients, and if potassium is the lowest, that's as high as it's going to go. So if we go back and we think about all of our ranges throughout the world, if we go back and think about this a little bit, so our tropics is always nutrient limited. It's got warm temperature, it's got the water, it's got the moisture and sunlight, but there's actually just not as much nutrients there. It has to do with circulation, it has to do with erosion, things like that. Then our next level is if we go to the other end, our polar region is light limited. There are more than enough nutrients up there. That's how come we get this crazy, crazy boom, is because when we get that, further north that we go, that nearly eternal sunlight, it makes up for that lost nutrients. So you get this huge, 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 huge boom. And then our temperate regions is sort of a flux between those two, right? So in the springtime, the system was light limited, and then the light is growing. And then in the fall, we're now nutrient limited. So we had that nice summer, and now we've used it up with the light, and now we're running out of nutrients, and flips over to the other side. Or sorry, yeah, light limit on the other side. So the question is, how is it that birds knew to follow the pot of gold? How do they know to do this crazy migrations that some of them are known to literally fly halfway across the world? What was the instigator in their minds to leave someplace warm and cozy and comfy and head somewhere new? Well, we have a few different theories about this, and it always starts off with birds in the tropics. This idea being that they would have been in this happy, warm climate, and there had to be some advantage to leaving. And so one of the theories is that as more adventurous behaved birds started traveling further and further north, and there was more available food with it, then they started having larger and larger clutch sizes. So they'd have more eggs per litter, right? So if we think about the laws of averages, tropical birds have smaller number of eggs per nest, whereas if you go further north, they often have larger larger, hatch more eggs. My words are running out. That's okay. Right? So there's an advantage to going. Now, they would eventually keep traveling with that and making those cycles back and forth. So, and then they either become different species or they get genetically distinct from the stayer at homers, right? This little piggy went to the market, this little piggy stayed home. And so now when we look at the range of that and the distance they're willing to travel, there's a really cool sequence that we see kick in. So what this is showing here is thinking about birds arriving and departing from their migration route. And so you can see that at the bottom of well, not quite, we've got the States here, doesn't quite have enough of Mexico in it to fully call this the bottom of North America. But at the bottom of the States, we've got birds that either maybe don't even leave at all, or they just show up really, really early in the year, right? So even February, it's warm enough for them to have a good time now. And then as you travel northwards, you can see the cold, our seasons shifting, you can see the birds following that, and then they do the same thing in reverse. And so something to just point out in here is if we look at the very top of Canada and we look at that high Arctic area, those birds are making that trip to show up in end of May, and they only stay until late July. So there's enough, that trip is worthwhile for them, even though they're only going for really May, June, and July, if that, really 2.5 months for some of them. So there has to be a whole whack of food up there for that to be worth their time. So we can see this in examples of birds that we see today. If anyone was around for one of our Merlin webinars, we were talking about yellow warblers. It's kind of one of those more intimidating groups of birds because they have all these different color patterns. And is a warbler even a warbler? Is it a New World warbler or an Old World warbler? If I say warbler one more time, it's going to melt in my mouth. But they're a really good example. We can use the yellow warbler as an example of how we can track that migration through time. So today we can look at them. The non-breeding ones hang out in sort of Central America or South America, and then they make these really big treks all the way to the top and back. And so you can see that spread happen where they would have started off at the core and then they slowly pushed forward more and more and more. But the question, if you kind of let this sit in your mind for a little bit, the question is, well, why weren't they there the whole time? Why do we have this assumption that they spread from warmer climates to the top? And why was it that this wasn't always true? Well, one thing that's super hard to remember for our poor, small, very small human lifespans is that the world is not always as it seems now, right? Our world has always been going through these very mass changes, and animals have been changing alongside it for literally millennia, right? So when we think about how migration works and how these patterns have developed, it has a lot to do with our glacial cycles or interglacial and glacial periods. So the reality is that in the last 2.5 or so million years, we've had more than 20 different glacial cycles where the world gets real darn cold and then we melt and warm up again. And then we get really, really cold and our glacier sheets grow. The amount of habitable land decreases. Right in our last glacial maximum, which was around 20,000, 15,000 years ago and then started melting out, the world was covered 8% of the whole surface of the world, or we could say 25% of our land surface was covered in massive, massive ice sheets. Not super hospitable if you're a little tiny yellow warbler from South America. So when those ice sheets come down, it pushes all those buffers down with all of those climatic zones that we're used to going through. And then when things warm up again and the ice sheets recede, that climate follows it back up. And so today, when we think about it, today we have a much different story. Now we're only covered about 3% of the total Earth surface with glaciers, or about 11% of the land area. So much less than it used to be. And that also meant there's much more hospitable land for all these birds to move into. This is also a chance where I want to take a moment to delineate between why the birds are moving. It's not about the cold. We have this impression, there's a joke, we call them Canadians. There's the birds that are snowbirds, but we call a lot of Canadians snowbirds because they live up here when it's cold, and then when it's cold, they live up here while it's warm in the summertime, and then when it's cold, they head down to Arizona. They head down to Florida. We like to come and visit and escape the cold. Well, the reason why we're migrating is not the same reason why the birds are migrating. They're not migrating because it's too cold for them. Even hummingbirds, those little tiny little bodies, where they literally go into a torpor and shut everything down, they can handle below freezing temperatures. They're making the migrations because of food scarcity. If it's cold, you can always eat more. But if it's cold and there's no food to eat, then it's time for you to go. That's the real push to leave an area. It's all about following food into abundance and leaving when it's too scarce. If we were think about some of those maps, there are different times. We've talked about it in the past with surf scotters. We talked about it a little bit if you're looking on that map with yellow warblers. Non-breeding pairs often don't migrate for lots of different species. And that's because they don't have the same demands for food, right? If you're not trying to reproduce, if you're not trying to grow a whole new little baby bird, then you don't need as much food. So you can stay in a place where there's less abundance, but there's consequences to that. So then those other birds come back. It's not that there was no food there just wasn't as much food. So that's why the migration kind of kicks in. Okay, so now this is the most important thing. We migrate for food, not for cold, right? Now, what drives the birds to know when to migrate? Oh my gosh, this is one of those fun questions, which is so different on multiple different species. But really, it comes down to this sort of mishmash difference of photoperiod is sort of the big one, right? So the longer days of daylight, the birds know, hey, it's my time to kick off. And some of that's genetically coded, right? We could keep everything, if we could keep them in a box that had everything the same, where food available, the weather was the same, but just genetically, their bodies are itching to get going. And of course, German scientists, being German scientists, came up with a specific word for this. So that restless behavior where it's time to migrate, it's called let's see if I get this right, Zugenbruch. There's an HE at the end, so I'm not sure where the part goes. But I like to really, or I have a lot of empathy for the birds at that point, because I too get about a seasonal migration itch every once or twice a year. So I think maybe I still am part bird. It's hard to say. Right. So there's just a genetic coding that exists. And of course, there are the local conditions. When the food availability starts to change, social cues from other birds, when competition gets too high, the local weather, right? All of those can drive when it's time to take off and head north or return back south. Now, the how they travel or how they know where to go is yet again one of the coolest freaking things in the natural world, in my opinion. For folks who remember, I did a whole animal navigation webinar. I guess it was a little while ago now, maybe in the springtime. So I'm not going to relay this, or I'm not going to dig into this too much, but essentially, there's a few different ways that we can know to track. Birds are able to navigate via the sun, via the moon, and the stars. So they are keeping track of that, and that's for northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere. It's less about the actual North Star, it's about the rotation of the stars around a singular point, so they're able to track that. They also have magnetite in their very small amounts of magnetite, which basically means they do have a little internal compass that helps them guide their way. There's evidence in homing pigeons that they're even able to use smell as one of the ways to find their way. So huge wide range of skill sets, different for the bird species depending on how far they're going and what their livelihoods are. Pretty amazing. And another thing is that they are going back to places. So they do actually create routes. And what I mean by that is that they have preferred flow paths. So this is kind of a cool map of North America. It shows a bunch of different biomes that have been color coded. And so what we know, especially for different waterfowl, like geese, cranes, ducks, things like that, is that they are actually moving from water body to water body. They are going linearly, but they're keeping track of food source to food source as they're doing that north-south fluctuation. And so they also have found that birds take sort of a circular route. So they'll go up one side and then they'll come down the other. And it has to do with taking advantage of different wind patterns, right? You don't want to be fighting any more extra energy than you need to. Another thing to keep in mind is that when we're thinking about difference between large birds and small birds, there's advantages for both of that. And, when we start to see those really big those really big flocks of small birds, getting too excited about all the little birds, then they tend to migrate in these really broad fronts. It's almost like a weather cloud front moving towards you sometimes when you can see it really dramatically. But I would say that my all-time favorite migration story, and maybe some people have seen it, maybe some haven't, I think it's the late 80s or early 90s, was Fly Away Home with Anna Paquin. And this is like the inspiration, I think, for all little kids to want to migrate with the birds if you weren't already trying to. Right, so this is really where you get the concept of what a flock is. It's these birds. In the story, little girl has this flock of geese that she raises, and then she helps them do their first migration so that they know where to go. It's very, very cute. The idea being that once they join in with the bigger flock, then they'll have someone to follow. So she gives them someone to follow. It's very, very cute, very heartwarming. I suggest you watch it for Thanksgiving. It'll bring everyone to some good laughs and maybe a couple tears. Right, but what really is a flock of birds? Is there a leader? Is someone in charge? How are they choosing where they're going? How are they moving as a unit, right? There's all these questions that got to come up when you see them moving together so much in sync. It's kind of amazing. Well, the first thing or the first myth to get rid of is that flocks don't always consist of just one species. We can often have them as mixed flocks, and they are functioning together as a unit. They don't just happen to be together. They usually like to be sort of same body size or same rough composition as they travel together. So this is a picture of some trumpeter swans, tundra swans, and a sandhill crane. So these waterfowl are making their migratory route together. Advantages of that, right? Bigger groups, you've got some predator defense. You are sort of sharing a food competition, but the idea is that the benefits outweigh the contrasts. Now, let's think about what it's like to move as a flock, right? So when we think about those bigger birds flying in V formation, they're doing it because it's an advantage for them. Anyone who gets a little bit nerdy about airplanes or thinks about things like drag and force and lift, the reason why they're flying in a flock is because it's one of the most efficient ways to get energy from the person flying slightly in front of you and next to you. What I mean by that is that when you look at a bird's wing, and there's air going above the wing and below the wing, and so the air goes above and below, and then it comes to the point of their wing, and then it creates these little spirals. Sometimes we can see them when planes fly by, depending on the humidity in the air, right? But they create these little tiny vortices. And those can be detrimental if you're trying to go across them. They're really hard. It's one of the reasons why we have a lot of rules in our airports, is so that we don't accidentally destabilize smaller planes and whack them into the ground. But if you're going with them, you can use them to your advantage. What I mean by that is that Canada geese can fly around 30 or 40 miles an hour, and it takes them 30% less energy to fly that fast if they fly next to someone else's wing vortex. So this is what that is kind of from a side profile. When their wings beat downwards, that forces the air down, and this forces the same amount of air to come back up. So imagine the buddy in front of you push the air down, and that air is going to want to come back up. Well, how perfect is that? Because it's going to lift up the next bird behind them. So they get a little bit of a lead from the person in front of them. So it's not that the goose at the front is the lead bird. They can switch and cycle through, and they do very often, right? Because the one at the front doesn't get a helping hand from the bird beside it. So they'll cycle through who's in front with whoever has sort of the most energy, and then the other ones can go to the back and take a bit of a break. Pretty solid teamwork. Now, if you're wondering why don't all birds do this, if it's such an advantage, right? 30%, that's a fair amount of energy that they can save. It has to do with how big they are. So it has to do, when we correct that a little bit, it has to do with the ratio of the size of their body to the size of their wings. So if you have really long wings relative to the size of your body, there's a big vortex for you to pass on to the next one. If you have little itty bitty wings, little itty bitty body, and they're really close, that vortices doesn't go very far, and so it doesn't help the person next to you. It just kind of dissipates and disappears. So that's the reason why little birds don't fly in a V pattern. They fly in a flock, or in I'll call it a loose flock formation, rather than an organized J or V. Bet you didn't know you were going to learn about flying today. Well, maybe you did. I guess we're still talking about birds. Okay, so advantages of being in a flock. I hinted to one of it before, right? But one of the big advantages is defense, right? There are lots of predators out there looking for them, avian and otherwise. And so it pays off to work as a group. And one of probably the most impressive, what am I trying to say here? One of the most impressive flocks that people get excited to see, although some people have very different emotions about them than others, is the peregrine falcons. They like to hunt starlings. And it's one of the reasons why starlings like to form these big, massive groups. So starlings, if you've seen them out and about in the world, they are kind of a stocky blackbird. They've got short tail, pretty triangular wings. They're very loud. I was at work yesterday. Yeah, I guess that was yesterday. and I was walking back to my truck and I could hear this very loud tree. And I was like, what is going on? And then I used my Merlin app. That's right, double checked, hit the audio button, just like we talked about in the last ones. And it was a whole flock of starlings. And as soon as I figured out what they were, they all took off into the air and then they all move as one. And that's the coolest thing about them. So when you watch a flock, it can literally be thousands upon thousands of birds. This one wasn't as big as that. This one might have only been a few hundred, but it's still pretty impressive. We call it a murmuration. They get their own fancy word because it's this impressive display. It's almost like watching like sound waves or like waves crashing. You can see them sort of like an orchestra is conducting them. And you're like, how in the world can so many birds fly together and not just continually be whacking into each other? Especially when you see them whack into the window. You're like, how is it that the same bird that hit my window is the same bird that can fly through the air in an amazing acrobatic display as this? Well, we're not the only ones that have been fascinated by them. A bunch of computer scientists were like, how do they do this? And eventually, a few people took some different tries at it, but they think they've got it sorted out. And it has to do with the rule of 7. The idea being that each bird is aware of the next closest 7 birds around it. It doesn't have to keep track of the whole flock. It is just aware of its closest 7 birds. And if any of those birds make even the slightest a millimeter change in direction or motion, then that bird corresponds and changes with it. And so it allows it to act essentially like a fully functioning nervous system where the slightest movement or tilt allows the whole thing to tilt as one. What that also means is that when a predator comes in, there are birds that are, careening out of the way out of the peregrine falcon, but there are other birds that don't even see the falcon. They're just reacting to the bird next to them. They have no idea where the actual predator is. So it's kind of an amazing defense system when you think about it. And maybe you might be wondering, well, if you're a falcon, why wouldn't you just dive bomb into the middle? Well, they also don't want to get hurt, right? They're trying to get a snack, but they're trying to not get whacked. Because again, when you are a bird, you have bones that, if you can't fly, that's game over. So it's one of those biggest things where the obstacle of this big moving organism is worth avoiding. Makes it worth it in the end. Now, also, just a quick bit of a throwback to our Merlin app. If anyone has it, I invite you to go look up the starlings underneath the explore function. And the reason why I bring that up, if we look at explore birds, do you remember when we were learning about how to use Merlin? If we're under the explore feature, it has different groups of birds all along the sides, just to give you a general breakdown of where you might find them. Waterfowl, raptors, there's hummingbirds, perchers, warblers, things like that. So if you look in there, so under blackbirds, there's lots of species, but if you look under starlings, very interesting thing is that there's only the one here in North America. We don't have any other ones, which it is possible that, evolutionary wise, we could have just gotten one. Maybe they all didn't join, but that's because, yes, starlings are indeed an introduced or invasive species. They probably have one of the most notorious, they're definitely infamous in the birding world, and they're a bit notorious on how they got here because, it's because of Shakespeare. Yep, we can all blame Shakespeare for the 200 million European starlings that now pretty much encompass all of North America. That's because in the 1890s in New York City, there was a group of Shakespeare enthusiasts who were apparently also birding enthusiasts. And their dreams and hopes and desires for North America was that it would have all of the birds mentioned in Shakespeare's plays to exist here as well. And so in Central Park, they released 100 starlings as mating pairs. And all of the ones that we have now in North America came from those original ones. So from 100 up to 200 million. So if you all go out and become birding enthusiasts, maybe we should hold off of our Shakespeare goals and our birding goals as well. But jokes aside, it is just a really intense example of how impactful introduced species can change things. And there's our European starling down at the bottom. Okay, so when we were talking about starlings being able to track one another, that was all in reference, we said that they use the rule of 7 and they see, right? Well, sight doesn't work so well at night, does it now? And so a huge, huge number of our birds migrate nocturnally. Again, this is also a predator defense. It also allows them to graze in the daytime, which is safer to do in the daytime. And so there's a huge number of birds that migrate at the nighttime. How are they able to move as a flock and not run into each other? Well, they're not like bats, not using echolocation, but they do a lot of short nocturnal calls as they're flying in order to communicate where they're at with each other, and even to some extent to do some sort of identification as well. Another big one when you think about it, flying is a lot of work. And so to keep from overheating, sometimes it's better to fly at night, saves a bit of an energy on that part. There's other small advantages too. The air is denser at night, so colder air is denser than warmer air, which means that it doesn't take as much energy for them to lift off. It's actually harder to fly in hotter weather. If anyone's ever noticed, it takes a long time for a plane to take off when it's hot. It takes a short time for it to take off when it's cold. Advantages like that. And so this is just kind of a cool image of those different tracks. But the other thing I want you to look at in this image is it also shows light pollution. And for our nocturnal migrators, light pollution is one of the greatest threats as far as their movement goes. It causes them to be disorientated. It increases the level of exhaustion because they're taking longer routes to avoid things. Predation, collision, right? So for us as humans, one of our goals we should all work together on is to be less afraid of the dark, right? A lot of our lights are aesthetic. A lot of our lights, we can make arguments for different safety things at different points. And I don't want to disagree with those, but I think that we've it's this luxury that we've gotten used to that we don't even realize is a luxury. And that luxury comes at a cost to other organisms and to ourselves, right? Different energy uses, things like that. All of that adds up. So this fall, if you do have a yard light, if you do have a porch light, maybe leave that off, figure out which lights you need to get on to get to your bed, and make sure everything else can be off for the night. Give the birds for the next couple weeks, give them a bit of a break. That's my request for our migrating friends. If you're curious about when those birds are heading off at night, right? That nocturnal migration usually begins about 30 to 45 minutes after sunset, and they don't fly all night necessarily. They'll fly for a few hours, make a big move, rest, settle, and then go again. And so this is that peak migration period, right? So even again, if you wanted to have your light timed on, sure, turn your lights on in the morning, maybe a bit more. Again, if you don't have to, you don't need to. But this is just a cool example. This one was a bit of a high one. This was from back in 2021. Now, we're talking about different factors that are affecting a bird's migration routes and the ways they're choosing to travel. Predation has come up definitely as one of the big ones. But what about if you're the predator? You're not really worried about predation then in your migratory routes. So what are the limits or bounds to your motions or to your migration if you're a golden eagle or if you're a red-tailed hawk or if you're a vulture? Well, for these birds, if again we go back to that very first birding webinar we did, if we look at the structure of the wings, we should be able to learn a lot about what their primary means of motion is. So these have long, broad wings, and if we think about where do we normally find them, we find them soaring, right? If you think about how a duck flies, very quick, rapid movements like Tweety bird, whereas these birds, they don't do a lot of flapping. They're banking on thermals. So thermals are hot air that gets heated up on land and then rises during the daytime. And so birds can use those with very little energy. They essentially use them to spiral up, and then they soar across the cold part, and then they spiral up. And that's how they work their way across the landscape. They do that day to daily while they're hunting, but they use a lot when they're migrating. And so this is what confines predator migration. Most of those bigger birds, the ones that are soaring, they need to move from thermal to thermal. And there are limits to where we find thermals. So you need to have the contrast between hot land and cold land, or between land and water. But it also means that big bodies of water, because that water sort of mediates the temperature, you don't get really good thermals on them, at least not in the same way. And so a lot of our birds then are confined to waterways, they have to avoid large bodies of water. So if we think about that from a South America, North America perspective, it's one of the reasons why we get these bottlenecks of migrations. And they're really cool to get to experience because you get this huge, huge number of birds that are essentially following that small tract of land through Central America. So point number 5 there, that little dot, that's an example of a raptor bottleneck. So lots of birds are traveling through that point, literally hundreds of thousands of them making that journey, which is pretty spectacular. And lastly, of course, not all birds migrate together. The reality is that some just do not get along well enough to spend any time together. And so robins are an example of that. They are flying solo not because you could say that there isn't advantages to spending time together. It's because they're so territorial that they will pick each other apart rather than travel together. So again, I feel like there's a few overlaps into the human world, right? Some people are made for group travel. Maybe some people are just better off traveling solo. All right. So we've learned through sort of the different mechanisms and drivers of that migration. Now let's talk about some of the routes and some of the different types of migrations that birds are making. So we're going to kind of split them up into different groups. The first one we're going to think about are long distance migrants. And I think these are the ones that we think about that come to mind the most. This idea of, these magnificent journeys that they're making from one pole to the other, or, traversing across the whole continent. Those ones really come to mind. And so for us, probably one of the most impressive ones, or the ones that's most well known, is a bird that probably not a lot of people have heard about. It's the bar-tailed godwit. And this shorebird makes a trip nonstop from Alaska to New Zealand. The longest recorded, it's over 6,000 miles, by the way. Not a short trip. Doesn't pause the entire time. And there was one female that was tracked, and she did it in 9 days, which is pretty freaking amazing if you think about it. That is a whole lot of flying. And I think that geese are recognizable for people, ducks, things like that. We're getting more familiar. The average person is quite familiar with those. I think shorebirds, which is what the godwit would fit under, are a bit more intimidating to start learning when you're getting off into the birding world, because they all move so quickly and they kind of dot around, and you really have to sort of sit and watch them for a little bit. I would argue that they're very much worth your time commitment. One of the names is they call them peeps as well, because of those little fluttering, they kind of flutter with the tide. If there is one, they move in and out. And so I'm going to introduce you to shorebirds for their spectacular migrations, and I'm hoping that that will inspire you to learn a handful of shorebirds wherever it is that you call home. And because they are such huge migrators, you'll only have to learn a few, and suddenly you'll be able to see them again year to year. So let's take that as the inspiration. We're going to start with the godwit to tell the story because it has one of the coolest migration stories. So how is it that these birds, and this is true for godwits, but the general physiology is going to apply for all shorebirds, so keep that in mind. How is it that they're able to be the undisputed champions of migration? Well, it's because they have the right shape of their wing. They're able to store a lot of fat on their body. They don't eat while they fly, and they're these insane bodybuilders. So let's work through those things and talk about them a little bit more one by one. First is shape. So we were talking about how geese are using shape to their advantage, right? They get that 30% offload from the goose in front of them, so that it gets a little bit lighter. Well, our shorebirds, they're banking on a different advantage. They have a really long pointed wings, so that enables them to carry a nice heavy load, which is what they're going to need to if they're going to be flying almost 2 weeks straight, right? And they need to be aerodynamic. They need a really long pointed beak is super advantage for their food style, right? They eat lots of little insects along the beach. Very, very cute. But it's also super aerodynamic, right? The more finely pointed it is, the better it cuts the wind, the less they have to fight with crosswinds. So that's a really, really big one for those really long distances. Also, their body shape, because it is so aerodynamic, they're able to fly to high altitudes quickly or more easily. And that matters because you and I don't think about it very much because we can't see it, but airplane pilots think about it and birds think about it, which is that wind doesn't move the same direction depending on what layer of the atmosphere that you're in. So birds will climb higher to find a favorable wind, a tailwind, to push them. Our planes do this too, right? They're trying to go to the level, we often go up to 33,000 feet, says your captain. And that has to do with the efficiency of your trajectory, but it also has to do with finding a nice tailwind, right? Sometimes you arrive at your flight 20 minutes earlier before you were supposed to because of that tailwind. And a little bird who needs to fly 6,000 miles is going to use that to their advantage every second that they get. All right, so they use this very narrow aerodynamic shape. That's part one. Part two, they can put on some fat. They are very, very good at it. They are able to double their body weight before they go on flight. And that is huge. They are not stopping for a snack. There is no 7-Eleven. There is no grocery store. They have to carry with them all of the energy they need for this entire trip. And that's water too. This is the other reason why fat is so, so amazing. We're getting ready for polar bear season, which means we're going to start talking about blubber. But when animals break down fat, they're also able to metabolize their own water from it. So that's how they're capable to go such a long time in that fasting mode, which again brings us to that fasting. A bar-tailed godwit burns 1 calorie for every 3 kilometers of flight, which is actually insanely small. I wish I could burn only a calorie for a single kilometer, or sorry, for 3 kilometers. Although, as I say that, I take that back, because if I did that, I would never ever lose any weight. So good Lord, it's a good thing that doesn't happen. But maybe I'd be able to go much further. Maybe the trade-off would be worth it. But just think about that for a second. 3 kilometers for 1 calorie. That's incredibly efficient. But even with that efficiency, they still need to conserve that energy. So when they're fasting, they are going to downsize organs. They actually shrink some of their organs that they're not using so that they can save on energy in that way. And so that's all about energy management. But they also need to be strong enough to fly that far. So this comes back to them being bodybuilders, just like Arnold Schwarzenegger. So they are able to, basically their pectorals up in here, that's where they're going to need to carry a lot of extra blood and a lot of extra tissue. And so they bulk that up before they go. And then by the time they arrive, they lose half their body weight. So they double it and they go straight back down. It's pretty freaking amazing that their bodies can go through such an extreme change in such a short amount of time. Now, the last thing is not just particular to shorebirds or godwits. This is particular to all birds, and I am absolutely amazed by it. But all migrating birds and all birds in general, right? Are they sleepwalking? How are they able to go 9 days, sometimes up to a couple weeks, without sleep? Right? I get cranky if I get like less than 2 hours of sleep than I wish I had, whereas they're able to go literal days without sleeping. Or are they? Right? So that if there were sleepwalkers, there are indeed sleep flyers. So maybe that's the reason why some of our birds accidentally hit the windows. No, that's a joke. That's a much different reason. Everyone should bird safe their windows. So birds have an amazing ability to control the hemispheres of their brain. And we've actually known this for a little while. And it's different from other mammals. So people might know this about marine mammals, right? In order for them to sleep underwater, they shut off half their brain at a time so that they know not to take a breath and they can come up and take the next breath. Birds are unique in that they actually have control over their sleep. So it's called unihemispheric slow wave sleep. Let's see if we can put enough syllables into that. What that means is that they close their eye, and whichever eye they close, they can then shut down that part of their brain and let that side of their brain sleep. They can even moderate it with how closed their eye is. So they can sleep with sort of half of the brain shut down, both eyes, or they can sleep with one shut down at one side and one awake on the other. And they're able to do this while flying. So if we go back to think about our geese and we think about that V formation, birds at the front are fully awake, and birds further back will sleep with the inside eye shut down and then still flying. And they'll also do that as a predator response too when they're on the water. If you see a bunch of birds all together and you notice one eye is sleeping inwards, then the outward eye is still on predator lookout. So they literally sleep with one eye open. It's absolutely incredible. Okay, so our long distance migrators are on track. They're ready to take their naps. And if we just think about general migration, we're not as species specific this time. Throughout North America, we essentially fall into different flyways. And what that means is it's a path followed by general species. So if you see a Canada goose in the Pacific, it's not likely to be one you would see next year in the Atlantic. They follow their own trajectories. And so that also means that speciation can happen, different things like that. It's not that they never mix, but it's just the idea that they have their own chosen path. So kind of fun to see if, which region of the world, where did your birds come from, right? We're getting into October now. Our birds are coming from up north and they're heading southwards. So any of our Florida friends, most of your birds came up from around Hudson Bay all the way up into Great Slave Lake, up into the high Arctic. And if you're on the inside, more on the Gulf of Mexico side, you are part of the Mississippi flyaway, right? And you're going to get those coming in again from sort of the same area, but now some of those birds are going to be coming in a little bit more from Alaska and on that main side. And Midwest, right? So all the way down sort of into going into Mexico now and Central America, those birds kind of took that straight shot up through the middle. And lastly, our Pacific flyaway, right? So that's going to loop in, grab the rest of Alaska, come down along the coast, and then sort of stay coastal too as we make those transitions. Okay, so that is, we're going to call it there for long distance migrations now. There's a lot more we could say about each and every single bird. That's the problem with these, is that there's always more we could talk about. But I'm going to shift us into medium distance migrants. And the reason why I want to talk about this into different brackets is that because when we see birds, I talk about them being a nutrient pump and that they're carrying it all across the landscape, but also that there are birds that are home to different zones, right? They don't actually go as far, but they still are migrating, right? And so we need to respect that their food sources are confined to a much more limited range. So we're going to keep working our way down. So let's think about medium distance migrants. When we're talking about them, we're talking about birds that are only moving a span of a few hundred miles. And depending on where you live in the world, a few hundred miles might not seem like a lot. But in some places, the climate is much milder if you go just a couple hundred miles north or a couple hundred miles south. So it does make a bit of a difference. And two, I wanted to use an example. I wanted to talk about the blue jay, and I wanted to talk about the eastern bluebird. So the eastern bluebird, pretty guy there on the right side, they kind of march to beat of their own drum. And the reason why medium distance migrants often get overlooked is because people often consider the behavior erratic. And actually, depending on if you read about them in different ways, people would call them residents. They would say that they don't migrate because they think that 100 miles isn't a true migration zone. The reality is that some years they will stay in the same spot over winter, and then some years they take off and they move a few hundred miles and then they come back. And so you can tell that these ones are more, it's less about these big seasonal changes and they're more focused in on their local conditions. But they do some form of migration. And the same is true of blue jays. Some people would consider them a resident. Some people consider them as this medium distance migrant. And also, while
Kristina,
I'll
I'm
back
so
up.
sorry, dear. Could you actually redo your Eastern Bluebird chat? You cut
Oh,
out there
I'm
for
so
a
sorry.
second, and I think we missed it. And I also don't see your screen yet.
Oh,
Um,
I am so sorry. Okay, I've gone back to the Eastern
no, you're okay.
bluebirds.
It just happened.
Okay,
There we go. Okay, we are back. Thank you.
okay. Sorry about that. The rest of it was okay though? Just checking.
Yes,
Hopefully.
yes, we got right up to the Eastern Bluebird and
Okay,
how people think that might be resident or erratic. But yeah,
okay. Sorry, everyone. Sorry about that. And hopefully we are clear for the last 5 minutes or so here, but we'll keep on rolling. So Eastern bluebirds, yes. The idea that, is it an erratic, or let me back up a little bit. People mistake residents for medium distance because of this zone of whether or not they move consistently or whether they don't, but they do often make these periodic changes. So for some people, you'll notice where it's like, hey, we had a bunch of bluebirds last year, but this year they're gone. And that's kind of one of those characteristic things of a medium distance migrant, is that they are still moving within a set range, but it's more to a local confined. And then on the blue jay side, the same story. The reason why I wanted to use these two as a medium distant migrant example, though, is because I wanted to train up a few things on our bird ID side as well. So these are both bluebirds in the sense that they are the color blue, but these birds come from very different families. So blue jays, for our folks out there, are actually in the corvid family. So that's the same as other jays, the stellar jay, but also crows, ravens, things like that. And so they have tool use just like crows do, right? But I think the important thing out of that is that when we're trying to think about how to track a bird, think about its behavior, right? So I'm kind of trying to tie us back into some of those previous skills we were working on. The blue jay if you think about crows or ravens, right? Those are also birds that don't migrate. So you can see some of those parallels into that blue jay's behavior where it's able to be resourceful enough to stay in a more food scarce environment. And then from the eastern bluebird side, we could again make that argument. So the eastern bluebird is part of the thrush family, so kind of like a robin in that same group, right? And they're a songbird, but they're able to adapt enough that they can stay in different areas with that fluctuation. And I'm just gonna check in on time here. I think we're all right. Okay, we're doing good. I'm gonna move us to short distance migrants. And again, some people wouldn't think about this as a migration in the traditional sense, but it goes through the same climate belt. It just does it in a much different way. So there are some birds that rather than traveling north to south, move top to bottom. Or what I mean by that is they move up and down elevations. This is a cool example. This is a dusky grouse. You can find them in Colorado. And then you can kind of see their range map in purple in the bottom left corner there. So all the way up into the Yukon, down south into the States there. And so these birds, they might only actually move 30 miles in their whole life, but that 30 miles is through thousands of feet of elevation. And so they follow when the summer warms up, they move up mountain, and when it cools down, they move back down the mountain into denser coverage. So it's kind of cool to think about because they're that altitude climb, that elevation climb, it mirrors the exact same thing as what happens with our latitude, right? We're following food abundance and food scarcity. So this is kind of a fun graph. If you look at it vertically, it's showing you the mountain moving up into that ice and snow range. And then if you follow the latitudes from left to right, you're again moving into that ice and snow. And so all animals are sort of caught between this axis of trying to find where can I get the most amount of food? Where can I get the most bang for my buck? And lastly, just a shout out to some of our permanent residents who don't go anywhere is the black-capped chickadee, which again is one of the cutest birds. I will be biased and say it. And again, remember, cute is an actual birding term. It refers to the roundness of features. So take that, anyone who says that you can't use cute in science. It absolutely works. Okay, so these birds, they are managing their food scarcity rather than following their food, they're storing their food. So I said for, if we go back to migration, we're storing food on our bodies, carrying that fat with them. Chickadees are actually have a really intense memory and they can find food caches. So migration is always about following the food, whether you choose to stay or whether you choose to go. And we're just about coming up to time here, but that's okay. The last thing I wanted to end on was how are we able to follow these birds through all these cool migrations? How are we able to know where they're going? Well, as with most good science, no one wants to admit it, but it was an accident the first time. So back in the day when they were starting to figure out radar and they were trying to find for enemy planes or they were trying to find cloud formations, because it did start off with weather, right? There were these huge migrations that they couldn't track. And this is a more recent one. But what you're seeing here is that those are not clouds. Those are masses. Those are fronts of birds taking off and heading south, right? And so I'm making a joke about science. There's lots of intentional science. But for the record, don't ever get too starstruck by science. There's always things that people just figured out just by chance. But once we know how to use something, we can make it a really amazing tool. So last couple times we learned about Merlin. This time, when we are done today's webinar, I highly, highly suggest that you go on your computer or go on your phone, type in Birdcast, because also through Cornell Lab, they have tied into all of these different weather radar stations all across North America, and you're able to look at big, broad predictions of where birds are going to be migrating. So tonight, everyone, October 3rd, estimated 317 million birds are going to be migrating overhead. Right? If you want to zoom in on where you live, you can type in your location and it will give you a general prediction for how many birds you can be expecting to moving through your area. So it's a pretty amazing tool. Please go check it out. It's very fun. And keep that in mind, right? That as while you're sleeping tonight, it's not just Santa that's flying overhead on different times of the year, right? These birds are making an incredible journey. They are connecting ecosystems across thousands of miles. They are connecting people through those ecosystems. And migration is always worth your time. So please stop, watch some flying geese, and take a moment to appreciate just how cool that journey is. And with that, I will pass it back to you, Brooke.
Thank you so much for all of that incredible information, Kristina. Just from everything from the long to medium to short migrations, that was fantastic. I will take a few questions here. I know that we're right to the end, but there are a couple good ones in here that I want to make sure we have a chance to ask and answer. So, first, could you maybe speak a little bit about climate change? Has it been affecting
Mm.
migration routes?
Yeah, I this could be a whole webinar in and of itself. That's the problem with some of these topics of where to put your energy and where to not. So yes, we were talking about timing of what decides a migration to start off, right? Birds are mostly timed into photo period. That's the strongest one. So that is the hours of daylight, right? Once the hours of daylight start increasing, they know that it's time to head north and follow that growing food source. So the tricky bit is that birds have evolved that they've synced up to a time system where they expect it to get warm at a certain rate. From a climate change perspective, we've now increased the rate that we're warming, and so we've essentially disconnected their internal clock with their arrival of food species. So what I mean by that is that let's say our bird is still taking off on May 1st, and it used to be they arrived on May 15th, right when the caddisflies were blooming, let's say, or the cicadas, or not cicadas. We'll stick with caddises. Those are aquatic. We'll go with ducks. Um, well, now, because our northern latitudes are warming more quickly, the caddisflies, that insect larva has already taken off, it's already gone, and so those birds are arriving out of sync with their food source. So imagine showing up tired, hungry, worn out, and then finding out there's no food left. That is having huge effects. Now, some birds are alternating where they're going, but the reality is that those shifts are happening at a scale faster than an evolutionary clock, and we don't know how the consequences are going to shake out.
Yeah, so definitely have an effect there for sure. So the next one, for those of us that like to put out bird feeders, should we consider when we put those away if we know that we
Mm.
have migratory birds? Or how does giving a food source affect bird migrations?
Yeah, this is such an interesting one because there's different camps. There used to be an old line or an old saying that said, take your bird feeders down after Labor Day because you're encouraging birds to stick around. And again, there are different studies, but the general consensus is that they will still keep moving on, right? That itch to move, you might delay it a little bit, but the reality is that you're most likely the cost benefit is that you're actually giving a greater number of birds an energy increase to continue that journey rather than depriving them of it. Especially if you've had a bird feeder there consistently, a lot of birds map food sources and food locations. So by taking it down, you're actually creating a more unpredictable environment from them. You're better off to leave it up, let them finish their migration and take it. You're, the behavioral patterns of a handful that might stay a few days longer is far outweighed by the ones that you're going to help along that journey.
Great, thanks for that. And one last time, what is the Merlin resource to watch that, like essentially heat map of where the migrations are?
Yeah, it's not through Merlin, but it's through the same lab. It's called Birdcast. Or oh my gosh, my brain. CAST. Like weather forecast, but Birdcast, and it'll come up on your first Google search.
Perfect. Thank you. So that is the last question we will take for today. So, Christina, I would like to turn it back to you for any last closing comments.
Thank you everyone for coming along this birding journey. There's always a great collection of people. I'm a shout out to our flamboyants and flamingos. It's always fun word alliterations for names of different flocks of birds. But yeah, thank you everyone for tuning in for this and the previous webinars. There's going to be a bit of a lull. I leave for bear season in a week, almost exactly. So very excited about that. There won't be any birds for a bit, but hopefully we'll continue the webinar series on the other side. And yeah, just take care, everyone. Please enjoy your fall.
Thank you so much, Christina, for taking the time right before you go to Polar Bears to get another Becoming a Birder series, and we definitely all appreciate it. And I would like to thank everyone who tuned in. Join us tomorrow for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have that replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.